The gravel of King William Island doesn't look like a graveyard. From the air, it's a flat, colorless stretch of Arctic nothing. But walk the shoreline near Erebus Bay, and the ground starts to give up small, wrong shapes among the stones. A curve of white that isn't a shell, a fragment with the unmistakable architecture of a human skull. For close to 2 centuries, these fragments were nearly all that remained of 129 men who vanished into the ice in 1845. In June of 2026, 4 of them finally got their names back, identified by DNA extracted from bone that had been sitting in that gravel since before photography existed. This is how that happened, and what the science found once it started listening. In May of 1845, 2 ships left England under about as much national confidence as the Victorian era could manufacture. The HMS Erebus and HMS Terror weren't ordinary sailing vessels. They'd started life as bomb ships, built with hulls thick enough to absorb the recoil of heavy mortars. And for this voyage, the Royal Navy had reinforced them further with iron plating and internal crossbeams meant to withstand the crush of pack ice. Below deck sat something stranger still: steam locomotive engines, stripped of their wheels and bolted into the hulls to turn the ship's propellers. It was the first time steam power had been sent into the Arctic at this scale. The holds were packed with 3 years of food, thousands of tins of preserved meat and soup, along with libraries, hand organs for music through the winter dark, and instruments for measuring everything from magnetism to the salt content of seawater. In command was Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, a veteran of 2 earlier Arctic expeditions, described by the men who served under him as steady rather than brilliant. His officers were considered the best the Navy had. James Fitzjames captained the Erebus, 32, magnetic, the kind of officer people remembered. Francis Crozier, older and quieter, commanded the Terror. Among the crew was John Gregory, 37, an engineer from Leicester who had nothing to do with the Navy's old sailing traditions. Gregory belonged to the new industrial world. His job was keeping those temperamental steam engines running in temperatures they were never designed for. He had a wife, Hannah, and 5 children in London, and for a man like him, a successful passage through the Arctic meant promotion and financial security that a lifetime of ordinary naval postings couldn't offer. The ships were last seen by 2 whaling vessels in Baffin Bay that July. The whalers reported the officers in high spirits, confident they'd reach the Pacific within a year or 2. Then, the Erebus and Terror sailed west into the maze of Arctic islands, and the world didn't hear from them again. For the first few years, nobody worried much. The ships carried 3 years of supplies, and getting frozen in for a winter or 2 was an expected part of Arctic exploration, not a crisis. But by 1848, the silence had gone on too long, and Franklin's wife, Lady Jane, began pushing the Admiralty into what would become one of the largest search operations in history. Dozens of ships, over a decade, chasing a reward and a shrinking hope of survivors. What they found, piece by piece, was a story that got worse the longer it took to tell. In 1850, a search party located the expedition's first winter camp on Beechey Island. 3 neat graves, the men buried with full naval honors, evidence of an organized, disciplined crew. No note about which direction they'd gone. It wasn't until 1859 that a search sponsored by Lady Franklin found the only written record the expedition ever left behind, a single sheet of paper in a stone cairn at a place called Victory Point. The first entry, dated May 1847, was routine and confident. Wintered at Beechey, now at the north of King William Island, all well. A second note had been squeezed into the margins around it nearly a year later, dated April 1848, and the handwriting alone tells you something changed. It reported that Franklin had died the previous June. 9 officers and 15 men were already dead. The ships had been trapped in ice for 19 months and were being abandoned. The 105 men still alive, now under Crozier and Fitzjames, intended to walk south toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland, hundreds of miles across some of the least forgiving terrain on the planet. To understand why that walk went the way it did, it helps to look at how the disaster built, because it wasn't one bad call. It was a chain of decisions that each made sense on their own. The summer of 1845 brought unusually open water, and the ships made faster progress than expected, pushing further west than most expeditions before them. When ice started closing in that first winter, they did exactly what they'd trained for, found shelter at Beechey Island, and waited it out in reasonable comfort. Losing 3 men out of 129 that winter was, by the standards of the time, an acceptable cost of doing business in the Arctic. The real trouble started the following summer. When the ice broke up in 1846, Franklin had a choice: push north toward what some believed was open polar water, or head south and west along a route that looked, on the charts available to him, like a direct line to the Northwest Passage. He picked the southern route. There was no way for him to know he was sailing into a geographic trap, a place where prevailing currents jam multi-year pack ice against the northern and western coast of King William Island, year after year, with almost nothing able to dislodge it. By September 1846, both ships were locked in. Not the seasonal ice they'd already dealt with once, but a solid mass, miles across, that wasn't going anywhere. The following summer never really arrived. Temperatures stayed low, the ice held. Franklin died that June. The cause was never recorded, and commands split between Crozier and Fitzjames. What followed inside those hulls was slower and stranger than a shipwreck. The coal that once seemed limitless was rationed to keep the stoves lit through frost-thick walls. Gregory's engine, the one he'd nursed across an ocean, sat dead in the hold, useless with nowhere to sail, and a threat the men couldn't see was already working on their bodies. Forensic analysis of remains recovered from King William Island in the 20th century found lead levels in the crew's bones far above anything safe, likely from a combination of poorly soldered food tins and the ship's water systems. Lead poisoning doesn't just weaken the body, it clouds judgment, breeds paranoia, degrades the exact cognitive sharpness a crew would need to survive an Arctic winter with no way out. At the same time, the lemon juice they'd carried to prevent scurvy had lost most of its potency after years in storage, and the men's gums had started to soften and bleed. They were being poisoned and starved by degrees, at the same time, while trapped in a ship encased in a landscape that gave nothing back. By April 1848, 24 men were already dead, roughly a fifth of the crew, and that was before anyone had set foot on the retreat march. The 105 survivors lowered themselves onto the ice, hauling flat-bottomed boats mounted on oak sledges that weighed as much as 1,500 pounds each, across ground that wasn't smooth sea ice, but jagged limestone shingle that could tear through boot leather in days. James Fitzjames, the man who'd once written cheerfully about dinner parties and staged plays to keep morale up, was now leading a column of men whose bodies were failing in real time. His signature on the Victory Point note is visibly shakier than anything he'd written before. The march went about as badly as the geography allowed. Every mile gained cost lives. Men who no longer had the strength to dig graves in the permafrost left their dead where they fell, sometimes under a few loose stones, sometimes in the open. Inuit witnesses who observed the retreat from a distance described a long line of gaunt, hollow-eyed men dragging heavy loads, some snowblind, some doubled over with what sounds like advanced scurvy. What the men chose to keep hauling is its own strange evidence, not just food and tools, but silver cutlery, silk handkerchiefs, boxes of books, even sections of curtain rod. Some historians read this as a kind of cognitive breakdown tied to the lead poisoning, men clinging to the symbols of who they'd been, even as their bodies gave out. Letting go of the silver meant admitting they weren't Royal Navy officers anymore. At a site now called the Boat Place on Erebus Bay, the retreat effectively stopped. Searchers later found a massive sledge there carrying a 28-foot whaling boat, 2 skeletons inside, and a strange assortment of belongings around them: soap, boots, silk. It wasn't a campsite. It looked more like a wreck that had happened on dry land. When researchers including Owen Beatty and later Douglas Stenton examined bones scattered around this site, they found something under magnification that the Victorian public was never prepared to hear about. Fine, precise cut marks on several bones, consistent with knives rather than animal scavengers. In the final weeks of the retreat, starving men had turned to eating their own dead. For over a century, that was roughly where the story stopped. The ships themselves had vanished from the coordinates in the Victory Point note, and finding them became one of the long obsessions of Arctic archaeology. Inuit oral history described a ship drifting south before sinking near an island they called Utchilik, and even mentioned a body still on deck, a detail Western searchers mostly dismissed for over a century in favor of trusting the official coordinates. They were wrong to dismiss it. In September 2014, a Canadian survey team using sonar picked up a ship-shaped shadow in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, sitting in just 36 feet of water, remarkably intact. It was the Erebus. 2 years later, the Terror turned up further south in what's now called Terror Bay, resting in about 90 feet of water. Neither ship had been crushed by the ice, as everyone assumed. They'd been abandoned, drifted, and settled quietly into the silt. Finding the wrecks answered where the ships ended up, but it didn't identify a single one of the scattered skeletons on King William Island. That answer required a different kind of search, not sonar, but genetics. Starting in the 1990s, archaeologists began systematically collecting remains from the retreat sites at Erebus Bay, focusing on teeth and dense bone like the petrous portion of the skull, which holds DNA better than almost anything else in the body. The obstacles were significant. DNA degrades constantly, and 170 years of Arctic freeze-thaw cycles and ultraviolet exposure isn't kind to genetic material. Worse, decades of scavenging and disturbance had mixed the remains together. A single cluster of bone fragments might belong to 3 or 4 different men. Before anyone could identify a name, researchers first had to sort the remains back into individuals. Teams from the University of Waterloo, Lakehead University, and Trent University built what amounts to a genetic archive of the Franklin crew. Mitochondrial DNA passed down the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA passed down the paternal one. But a genetic profile is only useful against something to compare it to, and most of the sailors had died young and without children of their own. So the researchers turned into genealogists, tracing family trees back to the 1840s, publicly appealing for anyone who believed they had a connection to the expedition to send in a cheek swab. The first real match came in 2021, a set of skull and limb fragments, cataloged for over a century as simply unidentified, produced a DNA profile that matched a living descendant in South Africa. Genealogical tracing gave the bones a name: John Gregory, the engineer from Leicester who'd written home to Hannah about the icebergs and asked her to remind their 5 children he loved them. The evidence suggests he survived the ship, made it as far as Erebus Bay, and died there during the brutal first summer of the retreat in 1848. The bigger breakthrough came in 2024, when researchers examined a jawbone and several other fragments from the same site. DNA pulled from a molar, protected by hard enamel for nearly 2 centuries, matched a descendant in the United Kingdom. The remains belonged to Captain James Fitzjames. Finding Fitzjames among the dead at Erebus Bay confirmed something the record had only implied. Even the highest-ranking officer on the Erebus didn't escape the retreat's slow collapse. He was in the same harness as everyone else. But the jawbone carried a second finding that landed harder. Under magnification, researchers counted more than 40 distinct fine cut marks on the bone. Not the ragged damage of scavengers, but the precise signature of a blade. Fitzjames, the captain who'd once hosted dinner parties on a frozen ship, had been eaten by his own crew after his death. In a navy where a captain held something close to absolute authority, the fact that his men reached a point where they used his remains for food says something about how completely the structure of that world had come apart by the time they reached the coast. Identifying Gregory and Fitzjames, along with 2 more men whose matches were still being finalized as of mid-2026, closed a gap that had sat open for 170-plus years. But the identifications did more than fill in a naval register. In South Africa, Jonathan Gregory had grown up with a family story about an ancestor who'd sailed into the ice and never come back. A piece of half-remembered lore rather than a documented fact. The phone call from Canada turned that story into something real. He later traveled to the site where his great-great-great-grandfather's remains had been found, and standing on that same limestone shingle, the distance of 170 years apparently felt much smaller. It stopped being about the Northwest Passage or imperial ambition. It was about a man who'd worked in an engine room and asked his wife to remind their kids he loved them. The remains themselves aren't kept in a lab as curiosities. Once the DNA samples are taken, the fragments go back to the stone cairns on King William Island, returned to the ground where they were found. Over 100 men from the expedition are still unidentified, and the work continues. Every few months, another family comes forward with a cheek swab, hoping for a connection to a name on a list from 1845. There's one detail from the old Inuit accounts that no amount of forensics has ever confirmed or explained. They described finding a tent, years after the ships were abandoned, with several men inside. One of them seated upright, a telescope still in his hand, as though he'd been watching the horizon for a ship that was never coming. It's probably folklore by now, filtered through generations of retelling, but it fits the shape of what actually happened. An expedition defined by waiting, for ice that wouldn't melt, for rescue that never arrived, and eventually, for the right technology to come along and read the names written in their own bones.